My name is Heather Wokusch, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Now, the continuing disaster at Fukushima, Japan, is just a tragic reminder of the dangers of nuclear power. But when you think of not only nuclear power, but nuclear waste and nuclear weapons and the possibility of nuclear war, it just gets overwhelming. And that can lead to a feeling of just kind of paralysis and I don't know what to do. Thank goodness there are groups around that are taking very positive action in order to counteract some of this. And one of those groups is the Physicians for Social Responsibility. And we are delighted today to have the president of PSR with us. His name is Dr. Andrew Kanter. Now, first, I would like to give you just a bit of information about our guest. He's been involved with PSR since 1982, when he started a chapter at UCLA. In 1985, he was appointed as the first full-time medical student liaison to the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize that year. Dr. Kanter is an associate professor for clinical biomedical informatics and clinical epidemiology at Columbia University. And he spends most of his job helping implement health information systems in Africa for the Millennium Villages project, which is connected to Earth Institute. So he travels globally, and he also has firsthand experience in understanding the effects of militarism across the world. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's just wonderful. Now, I think it's interesting to think that the Earth needs a doctor. Yeah. You know, so can you tell us a little bit about PSR?
Well, sure. It's actually our 50th anniversary year. We started actually in 1961, and we began by publishing information in the New England Journal of Medicine about the effects of nuclear war and how it basically could never be fought. And PSR became active at that point in time and really understood that it was necessary to bring a medical voice and a public health voice to these typical military and policy discussions that normally wouldn't have it, because it clearly wasn't being addressed. Now, since then, PSR has continued to work very hard to try to eliminate or at least reduce the risk of nuclear weapons being used again. And also to lower the risk of environmental contamination from nuclear materials through nuclear power and nuclear proliferation. And then in the 90s, we actually expanded to other grave threats to survival, including climate change and toxic degradation. So it seems, though, when you think about where we are compared to where we used to be, that the world has not been going in the right direction. And we feel like there needs to be a doctor, maybe a counselor, but also certainly an internist to help the planet figure out a way that it can survive into the future. Because, you know, I have a new 8-month-old child, and suddenly it's become really real for me. What kind of planet am I going to leave for them? And so even back in '82, when I actually heard from Dr. Helen Caldicott, and a lot of people know of her. She was a family friend and came to speak to us in California. And I was just so moved by her portrayal of just how dangerous a position this world actually is in, and I had to do something about it. And that's what motivated me to become involved. And I think about it now, we're actually no better off. Even with the end of the Cold War, people think, oh, nuclear weapons aren't a problem anymore. You know, we still got 20,000 of them, you know, that the nuclear weapons still pose a real threat. And then Fukushima shows the other side of that, which is that there's this tight connection between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and that both in terms of the production of the materials that are used in the bombs, or potentially, like we're concerned about Iran making their weapons. It's the same technology for plants as it is for the bombs, but also the waste and where that waste can go and how that can be used for bombs. That was how the North Koreans got their nuclear weapon. And this shows that, you know, not only is it damaging to the world to have these weapons around, but the plants themselves and the whole fuel cycle and how you produce those plants and the waste poses a risk to us every single day. So this is part of the reason why PSR has linked these issues, and we really try to speak from a medical voice. We We have we're scientists as physicians, but we don't try to be nuclear physicists or try to be foreign affairs specialists. We speak from our expertise as physicians. But PSR isn't just about physicians. We are probably the largest physician-led organization that works on like nuclear war and climate change, but we have thousands or tens of thousands of members that aren't. And I like to say that anybody who actually feels like they are concerned about the health of the planet can be a physician for social responsibility. And that's what we really think, that it's all of us together that are going to ensure the future for our children and grandchildren and their children.
And their children, hopefully. Because along this nuclear cycle, that's the thing, there is no room for any error. And it's humans doing it, and so humans make errors. And the effects just last forever and ever and ever. And so there's no possibility for errors. And so the whole thing becomes so overwhelming and toxically frightening. How do you deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the 80s, actually, we talked a lot about psychic numbing, and we even had the psychiatrists in PSR really helping people to understand how important it was not to be immobilized by the fear. And we don't talk about that so much now, but I think we probably should be, because it's just more complicated now. There's so many other ways that we might destroy ourselves that the nuclear weapons just seem like a very small reason now. But I think getting involved and really being active is important. And not only that, but it's not about eliminating nuclear weapons themselves. It's not about the nuclear power in itself. It's about really kind of having a set of values on which you can live your life that will produce a sustainable and happy and healthy planet. And that means changing your life every day. I mean, it's like whether or not you choose to throw that bottle out or recycle it, or you take the bus rather than take the car. And in terms of nuclear weapons, it's really about whether you're willing to sit back and tolerate these immoral and potentially planet-cidal weapons that just sit there. And, a lot of it just is out of our minds. And
the people making them are out of their minds too.
But I think they're motivated out of fear too. Now they're motivated out of a different kind of fear, and there's certainly the nuclear industrial complex is extremely hard. And I think one of the lessons we learned from Fukushima, and actually was brought up quite clearly in the Associated Press stories here, was that there is this sort of unholy alliance between the industry, the regulators, and the government in terms of nuclear power. And there's reasons why people have these weapons, and it is quite financially valuable to them and to the whole production line for them. But it's based on a fear of the other, and a fear of, that we might need to use these. But I just came back from Hiroshima, where I was at the 20th anniversary, 20th Congress of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, the one that I was at with as a medical student. And I had been to Japan in 1989, I guess, which was the first time they had the Congress there. And this was a real eye-opening experience, because most of the survivors, the hibakusha, of the bombings, really the only time that the weapons have been used in war, although weapons have been used over and over again for testing all over the planet, are almost all gone now. And listening to them tell their stories, listening to a girl who was, I think she might have been 16 or 17 at the time, who became like a nurse on the ground at that point, having to care for the people that were victims of these just horrific weapons, brought to reality in a way that none of these, The Day After or whatever these kind of movies can show, of just how horrific this was. And yet we perpetrated this on people. And these weapons that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are 1,000th of the strength now of the 10,000 weapons that we have in our arsenal today. So the notion that we might actually ever use these things again is just abhorrent. And and we don't have the opportunity to meet these Japanese people that actually lived it, and they're soon to be gone. So we have the responsibility to talk about it and communicate it, and never let it happen again. And the only way that's going to happen is to get rid of them.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And before you had talked about this collusion between industry and government and in hushing things up, but I would add the media also, because much of what's going on at Fukushima right now is not discussed. There was just a recent study saying that highly elevated levels of thyroid problems in kids who are under 18, and it's just not normal that would be going on, and the kind of food that they're eating is deeply inappropriate, because it's been radiated. And all of these things you don't hear about. You don't hear about them here, and you're not hearing about them in Japan so much. I lived in Japan for 12 years.
Really?
And so, and the fact, for example, that many of these, fuel rods are basically buried under earthquake fault lines, because that's the only communities that would allow it. It's just part of it, I guess, what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is that we don't have enough clear information. But when we do, then it is possible to hit that point. It's like, oh, this is way too big.
Right.
So what I really love about the PSR site is that it has points of activism that just normal people can do. And on the PSR site, you've got this activist center with things that each of us, you don't have to be a scientist or something, can do. And when you start engaging in that, then you start to understand that you really can make a difference. So I'm wondering if you can share with us some of these things that just anybody can do.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, first you have to go to the website and actually see. And we do have it broken down based on the topic. So if you're interested in nuclear weapons versus climate change or toxics and things like that. One of the most important things, of course, is to become educated, because I think, as you mentioned, a lot of people's fear is from the unknown. And radiation does exist everywhere, and it's ever since the Godzilla movies, people have a kind of a real fear of radiation. But there's a real fear, and then there's kind of an irrational fear. So getting an understanding of what the radiation actually means, or what the risks really are, is important. I think also trying to understand not just the bad parts of what these weapons and problems are, but actually the good parts, and not the good parts about the weapons, but what they tell us about ourselves. So one of the things that we've learned is, I mentioned early on before we started, that there's a new study that's out that if even a small number of nuclear weapons were used between India and Pakistan, who have fought 3 wars since their independence, if they chose to use their arsenals, or even half of their arsenals, that it would create such a climate change effect that up to 1 billion people would die from famine due to the change in agriculture. Now, you could look at that and say, oh my God, what are we going to do? We have to get rid of the Indians and the Pakistanis? No, we can't. Pakistanis, we can't do that. But what it tells us is that the world is interrelated, and how important it is for us to think about how we depend upon our ecosystem, and why it's important to care about what happens on the other side of the planet. So you can get strength from reading and being educated, and then you can speak out. And so there are ways to speak out. Nowadays with the internet, it's just remarkable, right? I mean, not only will our interview be broadcast over and over again, but the social networking and building relationships, and you can make your voice heard to tens, thousands, millions of people. So PSR provides a way for you to harness your concern, and with others in chapters around the United States, make those feelings known, whether it's presentations to the U.S. government for changing in policy. We just recently did a big activity at the United Nations as part of the arms trade treaty that was under negotiation. Normally a person wouldn't have any way to contribute to the UN negotiating a treaty to eliminate illegal arms trade. But through PSR and through the IPPNW network, we could actually contribute in the civil society's effect on these things. There's also a lot about this new sort of communities of coming up around these issues. One around Fukushima really was the Manhattan Project, kind of taken a name from the original creation of nuclear weapons, now thinking maybe there's a way to eliminate them. But there's these kinds of people-to-people and civil society taking an important role.
Actually, before we move on, can
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit about the Manhattan Project that you're talking about?
Sure, it's actually really exciting, and it's it's a collaboration of multiple groups, including PSR. It started by a group of artists, actually, who were interested in using their maybe perhaps more right-brain skills to achieve peace and elimination of nuclear weapons. Now it's a group of people from these different organizations, including many Japanese Americans, who are trying to figure out how to work together. How can physician's voice be added to the artist's voice, who can be added to the physicist's voice, or the teacher's voice, to really speak out in a positive way. And I think that, again, is what has, in some ways, we failed in the 80s to really eliminate these problems when everyone was, marching and everyone knew that we could be eliminated tomorrow. But somehow we didn't have the positive alternative vision. And I think that now working together with people from different ways of life, looking at maybe the positive alternatives to what we're doing, may make a sustainable solution.
So I know this Manhattan Project, from what I have heard, you've got Human Rights Now, you've got PSR, you've got artists. Is this based in New York at the present time?
It's sort of virtual. It's mostly in New York, I think. That's where most of our meetings have been, and hence the Manhattan name. But what we've had, and also Peace Boat has been a big part of this, is that with the internet, it doesn't really matter where you live.
So in relation to New York, now, of course, you've got this Indian Point nuclear power complex, and just last week a security lieutenant came out and said this place is awful. The people who work here are playing video games and they're watching DVDs and they're asleep on the job. Please do something. And so I guess for New Yorkers, and that's not the only nuclear facility in the area, what can people do here? The normal person, not a doctor.
Well, so actually PSR on its website actually does have a little tool that you can actually identify where the nuclear power plants are, and you can put in your address and you can see sort of where you are in relationship to them. And actually, since the 90s, we've been doing simulations using technical software to help kind of understand where the risks really are. And Indian Point, being one of the older plants and also of a design that is very much at risk, being within the 50-mile zone of Manhattan poses just an incredible risk. So it's true. 17, 20 million people live within the area that the NRC chairman said should be evacuated around Fukushima within this plant itself. And it's true that whether after 9/11 we looked at the security issues, whether an airplane could fly into one of these plants, whether or not it would just be an accident, or as what we've learned from Fukushima, it's what we don't expect that happens that leads to the accidents. And so really we've talked about evacuation zones, and the notion of evacuating 17 or 20 million people, in the case of an accident, is just ridiculous. Look what happened to Katrina, and they had 3 days worth of notice. There are things that do to protect oneself, but all of these things are really just the tip of the iceberg, and very little ultimately you can do. So the only treatment is prevention, and that means we have to do something about these plants. Now, there are certain plants like Indian Point that could probably be shut down right now. They have been shut down at times for repairs, and we all survived. And we would be at much less risk. There are many places in the United States where nuclear reactors, probably couldn't be shut down immediately, but certainly we need to be thinking about that. And a third of the population lives within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant in this country.
A third of the people across the country live within
50 miles of a nuclear power plant.
That's an amazing statistic. And there's also the case of all of these spent fuel rods that are,
and Fukushima really drew attention to that.
But here in the States.
Absolutely. And and it's actually worse in the United States than in Japan.
My father actually worked at Hanford, in which these cases, broke, and then they were leaked into the water and all of this. And so that's another issue, because how would you rate the integrity of the country's spent fuel rods that are being stored?
Well, this was one of the reasons why the Federal Appeals Court just recently ruled that they could be no further nuclear plant licensing or relicensing until they address this question of the waste disposal. Because right now, what you're talking about, the spent fuel rods, are kept on site in most of these nuclear reactors in pools that were designed as originally temporary holding places. That has to be in there for about a year or so after it's taken out of the reactor to cool before it can even be moved anywhere. But what's happened is, because there's no long-term storage for these plants, for this spent fuel, they built up, and there are tens, hundreds of times amount of radioactivity that are in the reactors actually stored in these swimming pools. Sometimes, as you saw in Fukushima, on the second story of one of these buildings. Other times, on the ground. But these fuel assemblies are basically kept in a building not so much different from a supermarket. I mean, it's not, a multi-foot thick concrete structure, which means any kind of accident that should happen to those will actually produce the kind of release of radiation that would be devastating. And yet we don't, no one even talks about that till just now. Maybe now they will.
Yeah, I mean, because for me, there are so many different parts of this story. Okay, we can talk about the, shutting down reactors, but we have so many generations and decades of this crap lying around that is so dangerous and so toxic.
For 500,000 years have to be kept out of the
500,000 years has to be kept out of the ecosystem. How do you do that? And many of them, as we discussed before, are not in places that they're safe, or at least. And so what I heard you say was that they've decided to look at that, but basically...
Well, so they can't start, the idea is to not produce more, although they will, because the plants keep operating.
Right. Yeah.
Then until they figure out what to do with it, and that may take years.
Yeah.
But there are some things we can do right now to actually make them safer. One thing is to get them out of these pools and put them into something what's called dry storage casks. And it's interesting that there were some dry storage casks in Fukushima, and they were completely fine with the earthquake.
Oh, really?
But the one when it's kept in the pool, when they're very tightly packed, if the water disappears, then they burn and release the radiation and the hydrogen, which cause potentially the explosions in those reactor plants. So first of all, we can A, stop making it. That's not a good thing. B, get them out of those pools and put them in dry storage casks where they can be more secure. And then ultimately, we have to figure out what we're going to do for our energy supply.
And pardon me for interrupting, but that's the thing that always kills me. They say, well, nuclear energy is actually a good bargain. You could say it doesn't cost as much, but then when you look at dealing with the waste, and these casks and those casks, and where do we store it? I mean, if you actually factor that into the equation, and you have to, it's just insane.
Actually, the CEO of Exelon and I'm not sure whether it was energy, probably wasn't energy. CEO of Exelon basically was saying that they don't even think nuclear power is financially viable, at least now. And that is because it's not just the waste. The costs of these plants are huge. When it turns out the end product of the cost of that amount of electricity can be produced cheaper elsewhere. And it's not a solution to global warming. That's the other side of it.
Exactly.
And so
now,
we have to...
Another area that PSR is involved with is environment and health, which clearly dovetails with this very, very nicely. And so can you tell us a little bit about your work in that area?
Sure. So global warming, climate change, toxic degradation, all of these things actually fit in quite nicely with the model I talked about earlier. And it's true that maybe climate change isn't going to kill us tomorrow the same way a nuclear weapon will. Inevitably, it will, and it will cause huge disruptions. So PSR is looking at sort of the fundamental changes in the way we think that is necessary for this planet to survive. And Einstein said this. He said, with the splitting of the atom, everything changed, save our modes of thinking. Except for our modes of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. He was saying, look, the world is a different place right now. So as physicians, we have a prescription. That prescription is...
Give me drugs.
Well, hopefully not to tune out. But actually, what are the things we can do in our daily lives that will lead to happiness, healthy, sustainable planet for our kids and for their kids and so on? And so for PSR, that's about, proper choices of energy. Nuclear power is a hell of a way to boil water. Are we going to leave this stuff you've just talked about for 500,000 years, to all of our kids' generations future, when, the best nuclear reactor is, millions of miles away, and it's the sun. Why aren't we using renewable energy as a sustainable way? We can't consume the way we consume in this society in a closed system, without having an impact on the environment and on our health. And so physicians have a prescription. Some of it is related to energy supplies, and other things about, how can you choose to live your life that it will lead to a positive outcome for the planet, as well as living hopefully a happier, healthier one for you and your family too.
Yeah, which is very important. Now, I'm wondering, when you go to some of these committee meetings and you've got defense contractors and then the military and the government people, and then you say, "Yeah, I'm a doctor. I'd like to talk about peace stuff." Do you ever get strange reactions?
Well, not so much actually. And there's a dialogue with decision makers, which is something that IPPW, the International Federation, has been doing in most of the nuclear weapons states.
And IPPW,
that's the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, the actual organization that won the Peace Prize in '85, and PSR is the U.S. affiliate, so all the American doctors are part of that organization. They're actually quite pleased, sometimes a bit shocked, as you mentioned, but that it's ultimately a medical message that kind of cuts through a lot of the fog of some of these policy issues. And one of the most fundamental reasons that we had a partial test ban treaty was that the physicians got involved, and it was actually collecting babies' teeth and showing that the babies' teeth had strontium-90 from the nuclear testing, eliminated the above-ground nuclear tests. It was Gorbachev's personal physician who, Evgeny Chazov, who was part of IPPNW, who explained to him why it was so critical to stop testing and why they had a moratorium. So physicians can.
The Earth needs a doctor. That's clear.
Yes. And they need anyone who wants to be a doctor to the Earth.
Yeah. So listen, we can't thank you enough for having joined us today with this very positive approach and things that we can take positive activism, regarding the whole nuclear nightmare element. So, as Dr. Andrew Kanter has said, please go to the PSR.org website. They have really interesting activities that you can do. You can learn. It's put in layman's terms, and so you don't have to be a scientist in terms of understanding it. And as he said, we need educators and consultants and just people who can communicate this very, very important message into the broader community in order to empower people to understand that the whole nuclear cycle does not have to be inevitable. So we thank you so much for having joined us today.